We're at the halfway point of the legislative session and just a week away from the next revenue forecast, which will have a big impact on what the state budget looks like. I'm Todd Myers, Vice President for Research at the Washington Policy Center, with the legislative update for the week of March 2nd, 2025. So, a lot happened last week, and this week, both the House and Senate will be voting on bills that made it out of committee. To help us keep people informed about what is happening in Olympia, make sure to share this video and like the WPC YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on all the activities. So let's start with an issue that Governor Ferguson highlighted in his first State of the State address, and the state Senate will be considering over the next week and a half, limiting the emergency powers of the governor. So the legislature adopted a modified version of a bill limiting the governor's emergency powers. Senate Bill 5434 would allow the legislature to end a state of emergency by a vote of the legislature or agreement of the bipartisan leadership of the House and Senate, known as the Four Corners. Now, it would have put a 30-day cap on any emergency orders that did not have the agreement of the legislature or the Four Corners. However, the bill was amended to allow emergency orders to continue indefinitely unless the bipartisan leadership of the House and Senate agreed unanimously to overturn that order. So if just one member of the Four Corners objected, Republican or Democrat, the governor would continue to have unchecked power under an emergency. So this change was so meaningful in the bill that the Republican sponsors of the bill actually ended up voting against it. Now, it's a little strange that the legislative branch seems unwilling to defend its power against executive overreach. So let's hope that the bill is improved when it's considered by the entire Senate in the next week. There was also some big news on the budget front as well, with the governor outlining some reductions to Governor Inslee's unsustainable proposed budget. The governor made it clear that he would increase spending significantly on K-12 and public safety, and he also promised to approve a pay raise for state employees. But he did offer a list of expenditures he would reduce from Inslee's very high baseline of spending. For example, he said he would look at ongoing commitments using COVID funding that were intended only for one-time expenditures. There are also a number of places, however, where the state can still cut wasteful and ineffective spending. So, for example, Governor Ferguson's budget apparently keeps the $60 million subsidy to purchase electric vehicles that was proposed by Jay Inslee when he left office. As we showed, the previous subsidy of $45 million was extremely wasteful and did almost nothing to reduce CO2 emissions in the state. In fact, much of the spending went to parts of the state where the average income is more than $100,000 per year. So given the seriousness of the budget shortfall, we shouldn't be subsidizing the purchase of $50,000 cars by people making six figures when it does nothing to help the environment. Eliminating that one program would double the reductions proposed by Governor Ferguson for the Department of Commerce. The proposal he put out there reduces spending by the Department of Commerce by about $56 million. Eliminating the EV subsidy alone would double that. So we do applaud the governor for backing away from Jay Inslee's completely unsustainable budget, but spending will still go up significantly, and there's a lot more work to be done. Now let's look at a few of the bills that will be considered in the House and Senate over the next week and a half. So first, both the House and the Senate will consider legislation that purports to protect minors when they're online. House Bill 1834 and Senate Bill 5708 would both require social media companies to provide tools to protect minors online. Unfortunately, both bills seem to think that minors need to be protected from their parents. As Small Business Director Mark Harmsworth noted last week, both of these bills require social media companies to notify minors with a, quote, obvious signal if their parents are monitoring their activity online. We should be making it easier for parents to track the activity of their children, not helping them avoid parental oversight. So let's hope that that bill is amended to fix this very strange and ill-conceived provision. The House will be considering a few bills relating to the high price of gasoline and energy in the state. House Bill 1409 would make the so-called clean fuel standard even more expensive and break promises regarding job creation made just 4 years ago. You can read my analysis of this really bad bill at washingtonpolicy.org. House Bill 1975 would reduce the price cap on the state's CO2 tax in 2026 and 2027. The cap would be about $80 per metric ton, which is still about 70 cents a gallon. By way of comparison, the price cap for this year is about $95 per metric ton, which is about 83 cents a gallon. Now, while a reduction in the cap is good, the price is still very high. And this is the typical pattern with complicated carbon policies. They end up costing more than expected, and politicians end up playing games with the numbers to save the system, rather than recognizing that complicated, politically driven climate systems and climate policies often do more harm than good. The House will also consider HB 1303, which would add environmental justice to the considerations that must be included in analysis under the State Environmental Policy Act, known as SEPA. These would add even more bureaucracy and delay regulation that even the environmental community admits is expensive and wasteful. The environmental community has actually tried to find ways to reduce some of the SEPA barriers to projects, and yet here we are adding more regulation and more barriers. If the bill passes, it would cost the state more than $21 million in this biennium to comply with the new regulations. But we wouldn't get anything more in terms of environmental protection. We would just spend more time and money on bureaucratic process. The cost would be the greatest for the Department of Natural Resources, which is trying to thin forests and reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire. So even as the state faces a crisis of overregulation, the House is going to consider adding more regulation. As further evidence that the legislature is actively working against streamlining state government, it will consider HB 1622, which would allow state and local government unions to block any use of artificial intelligence that would reduce hours or wages for their members. If the state finds it could use AI to provide services more efficiently, this bill would actually allow unions to stop that and make government less efficient and more wasteful. So over in the Senate, they will consider SB 5036, which is a bill we support that would require the state to report statewide CO2 emissions every year. Currently, data is reported years late, and the Department of Ecology has failed to comply even with existing law, meaning that by the time the CO2 data are available, they are completely useless as a tool for policymaking. This bill would at least make the data useful so that we can know whether our policies are working and keep the ones that work and get rid of the ones that don't. The Senate will also consider two bills that would reduce the threshold to pass school bonds from 60% down to 50%. Senate Bill 5186 would lower the voter approval threshold down to 50% to issue general obligation bonds, levy taxes on those bonds, or exceed the debt limit for a school district. Senate Joint Resolution 8200 would propose a constitutional amendment to do the same thing, but would also prohibit construction impact fees for developers. Now, the purpose of both the legislation and the constitutional amendment is simply to make it easier to increase local property taxes. Finally, if you like to hunt or to fish, two bills being considered by the legislature will interest you. Senate Bill 5390 increases the cost of a Discover Pass to use state parks by about 50%, from $30 a year to $45 a year. And Senate Bill 5583 would increase the price of the hunting and fishing licenses by about 38%. And lastly, we finally saw some spring weather, and my bees were active as the temperature was warm enough for them to get out of the hive for a little bit, which is why I am a big supporter of House Bill 1368, which creates several new specialty license plates, including the Washington State Honeybees and Pollinators license plate, with the funds going to support the Washington State Beekeepers Association. So we recommend that legislators support this bill because it's unwise to anger people who control millions of stinging insects. So that's it for this week. Remember to visit washingtonpolicy.org for updates throughout the week. Please like and share this video and follow us on X. See you next week.